Hello, Warp Factor. This is Alex Wallace here with the third author talk feature, this time with Alex Shvartsman, the author of The Middling Affliction and the editor of the Rosetta Archive, both reviewed by yours truly on Warp Factor. Care to introduce yourself, Mr. Shvartsman?
Hi, Alex. It's very nice to be with you. My name is Alex Shvartsman, so we got a double Alex feature going on today. I am an author, translator, editor, and anthologist from Brooklyn, New York. I've written several novels, two of which are published. The first one was Iridian's Crown that came out in 2019. And the second one is the one that we'll hopefully spend some time talking about today, which is The Middling Affliction, and it's coming out at the end of this month. I also have edited over a dozen anthologies and have written and published hundreds of short stories as well as translations from Russian.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shvartsman. So, just to start this off with The Middling Affliction, like what inspired the conceit of that book? What were you seeking to do with that book?
When I first set out to write about this character, and first of all, it's an urban fantasy that's a snarky, kind of funny, Dresden File-esque novel. When I first set out to write that character, it was a short story. And when I was writing that short story, it was fairly early in my writing days. And I set out to emulate the style of one of my favorite urban fantasy authors, and that's Simon R. Green. So I was trying to write a New York style story that is reminiscent of the Nightside series. And that's how that began. Once I wrote the first story and then subsequently the second, I felt very connected with the first person snarky, funny, sort of like very observational, humor laden voice of the main character. And I definitely intended to write more short stories in this setting, except Conrad being the grifter and the successful manipulator that he is, kind of grabbed my mind and forced me to turn it into a trilogy.
Yeah, such a master manipulator, he even manipulates you to write more about him.
Exactly.
So, one of the things that really struck me that when I read the Middling Affliction was its unique approach to magic and the meaning of Conrad's status and even the title. And I don't know how much of that you're willing to spoil, but would you be willing to talk about what inspired that particular aspect of the book, the sort of in between status, if you will?
Well, sure. First of all, I'm not super worried about spoilers because I feel like the back blurb on the paperback kind of gives you the plot of the first half of the book, which is okay because it's not all about the plot, right? It's about the journey.
Yes.
So in the story, the premise is that this is our world essentially, except 1 in every 30,000 people is born with the gene that allows them to perceive and cast magic. What that means is not only are they able to do the typical type of spells that you think of when you think about magicians, like, cast, enchantments and force shields and things like that, but it also allows them to see the world as it truly is, because there are, of course, vampires and trolls and all sorts of monsters that walk among us, except a regular human's brain kind of substitutes. So when a large burly troll walks by, a regular mundane person may see a big biker, or somebody, so our brains kind of help edit reality to hide out anything that we're not prepared to examine, whereas people who are gifted are able to perceive the world as it truly is. Now, Conrad is a far more unique creature than that. He is someone who is able to perceive magic the way the gifted do, but he has no innate magic ability. He can't cast any spells on his own. All he can do is use artifacts that are powered by somebody else's magic, which basically, and as he describes himself pretty much on the very first page, makes him this world's version of a magical Batman. He's got no superpowers. All he can do is bluff a hell of a lot and then use his wits to get out of a lot of situations. And he tries and gets his hands on all sorts of little trinkets and artifacts and charms and amulets and sigils and things that he can use to supplement his his bluffing skills and to be able to pass for a regular gifted, because people like him, called middlings, are extremely discriminated against in the society, and many would kill them on sight.
Okay. So, just from a writing perspective, what made you want to use a middling, like with that particular role in this society as your protagonist? Because when I'm writing and when I write about writing, as navel gazing as that sounds, I talk a lot about what can be gained from people in those sort of liminal places in society where they're not quite one thing, not quite the other thing. So, like what made you want to use this particular character with this particular position as the viewpoint of your book? 'Cause
So there's a couple of things that are going on here. First of all, one of the major themes of the book is the theme of discrimination and prejudice. It is something that I've experienced personally as someone who came to the United States as a refugee from the Soviet Union. It is something that I've seen around the world as I've traveled. I've seen it in our own country, and so it's an important subject to me. But I also never want to write about it in a way that feels preachy and forced.
right.
And so, if I did my job right, you get a fun, light book that still manages to touch on these issues in a meaningful way. And so, having a character who himself is living under the Damocles sword, if you will, of this extreme prejudice, and is has to be very conscious of it, essentially throughout his existence, is something that definitely appealed to me. This is from the third rail perspective of what sort of like the underlying theme of the book is. On another level, I'm also the kind of person who, when I watch superhero movies or I don't really read comics, but like interact with anything that's superhero related, I really dislike characters like Superman. Superman is boring because he's just too perfect. Has no his moral compass is pointing north exactly right. He's just you know what he's going to do in any given situation, essentially, right? So it's much more interesting for me to write about a character who is not nearly as powerful, who has to work much harder to get what he wants, or to accomplish what he wants to accomplish, and who's also at least somewhat morally ambiguous. I mean, Conrad is not a perfect person, and that's, to me, that's a much more interesting character, both as a consumer of fiction and TV shows and movies, and as a writer. I much prefer writing about people who are flawed and imperfect and interesting.
Okay, so to put it in terms that I think a lot of the viewers will understand, you prefer Batman to Superman.
Yes, except I don't know that Batman, even though Conrad identifies as Batman, I feel like, again, like it's you kind of know what Batman is going to do, right? Like, I mean, if you create any sort of a scenario for like any kind of villain attacking Gotham City, you know how Batman is going to react to that situation, and I wanted something that is slightly less predictable, and someone who just doesn't have it in his toolbox to defeat all problems by punching extra hard, or by being like a more powerful magician than his opponents. So I would rather have a character who is just forced to really think on his feet and problem solve, and sometimes make imperfect decisions.
Yeah, makes sense. Also, Conrad isn't a billionaire. He's just some guy trying to make his way in the world, and
Exactly.
uh,
He has to use these really expensive artifacts, because I've set up this whole shadow economy that takes place in New York City, where the story is set, but also like around the world, where these artifacts are. I mean, a powerful artifact will cost you as much as buying a house, and he is not a rich person, so for him, that's an extra layer of challenge. He has to really hustle in order to get his hands on any kind of magic, and then when he does have it, he has to use it sparingly.
actually, he's very much more a working class hero than like the I mean, because the Batman character comes from the 1930s, and there was a whole thing in the period where you watch the antics of the obscenely rich, like Richie Rich comes from the same period, for example, and so it's just an interesting shift in the cultural more in a sense because I mean one thing that I think Batman has become so predictable because we've been writing stories about him for about 90 years, so we get it, I and we haven't yet with Mr. Schwartzman's character, because he's new. I mean,
Right.
yeah. So
So I think it's interesting that you say that because on one hand you have Iron Man and these characters who are using their like billions of dollars
yeah,
to solve problems, and on the other hand you have these people that are constantly like super broke and are struggling to like pay the rent next month.
yeah,
Conrad is actually more middle class. I mean, he has means. He's just not wealthy, but he
yeah,
has means to like he makes kind of enough on his hustles where he's not worried about whether he's gonna have to eat ramen next month
yeah,
as his every other meal. So he's kind of a little bit more in the middle, which is also, as you pointed out, we tend to put these characters into kind of like the extremes, and he's kind of, he's more along the lines of where many of the readers I feel will kind of identify with that position.
yeah. That makes sense. That makes sense. Yeah, yeah. Because I mean, it's generally people like that who are, I think, the majority of organized fandom. That's not to say there isn't some diversity, but I think that's probably the bulk of the people who can go to conventions. Say that,
Right, you have to be able to afford a few $100s to go to a convention and then pay for the hotel room and the
yeah,
travel
absolutely.
and all that stuff. So
Yeah,
it kind of is, in a way, like a self-fulfilling
yeah,
prophecy
yes,
about who's going to end up there. For the most part, there are of course exceptions,
yes, yes, of course.
but that's so yeah. So he kind of, and I didn't really think deeply about that. It's something that this conversation kind of brought up, and I'm like, yeah, he is middle class. He doesn't really fit into either of those two criteria.
Okay. Okay. Here's a question that just came on to me. That so your novel is mostly set in New York, which is in some ways the most American of cities. It's probably, besides Los Angeles, the one that gets broadcasted the most to the rest of the world, to their continued confusion about how we work because I'm not sure we know ourselves. But you are an immigrant. And I ask this as someone who is kind of a second generation immigrant. My father is white. My mother came from the Philippines. So would you say that you have is the way that you write New York, is that influenced by the fact that you're an immigrant, because it's such an immigrant city to begin with, because there's people from all, it's the most linguistically diverse city in the world. So did that enter your thinking at all, or
Well, it must. I imagine that everything I write is colored, just like any author, is colored by my background
yeah,
and life experience. And so there has to be that element of an outsider's gaze involved in this. Having said that, I have lived in Brooklyn for 30 years.
okay,
And so I very consciously made Brooklyn, New York City, but Brooklyn in particular, essentially a living, breathing character
yeah,
in the story where you get the real feel of what it's like to live in the city versus the tourist feel of what it's like to come visit for 3 or 4
yeah,
days and just see the landmarks,
yeah,
right? So most of the action does not take place in Times Square
yeah,
or at the Statue of Liberty. It takes place on the suburban streets of South Brooklyn where no tourist really ever treads. But this is where I live, and so I can hopefully, again, if I did my job right, I can present that experience of what the life in the 2020s in Brooklyn, New York is like, in the glimpses of that, that are not just so it's not all magic. It's also just like these little references and touches. And what I tend to do is I tend to really draw upon the real history and geography of the borough when writing the series. So a lot of the locations are actual real locations where I can get away with it, or fictionalized versions of the real businesses and places. And so if you know, since you've read the book, you know that there's a lot of magic shops and other locations that are called out by name. Most of those are based on real locations, and I know exactly, like, if you were to say, hey, like, where is this particular, you know, where's Mordecai's Jewelers, or where's the Russian bookstore which sells which sells magic items from, like, you know, like their secret second floor, and I know exactly which building and which part of the borough that's based on. So there's a lot of that. There's a lot of the plots, especially in the early parts of the book, that revolve around the sort of the structure and like the real estate in Brooklyn and how it's being developed and things, without giving spoilers. So a lot of that is, it's reality meshed with secret history, which is my favorite thing to write.
I mean, it reminds me of a more fantastic version of it. I think it was Raymond Chandler who said, "Every murder is the story of a city," and he was talking about detective literature. And I don't know if you've read that big anthology, Down These Strange Streets, edited by George R. Martin and Garner Dozois. It's a big urban fantasy anthology, and in his introduction, Martin argues that urban fantasy came from the confluence of the hardboiled detective story and the horror story. And I, I wouldn't say the Middling Affliction goes into straight up horror, but I can certainly see the detective element in it. And I don't know where I was going with that.
No, I agree with you absolutely, and I even have Conrad self-referentially wear a trench coat, which is kind of a nod to the fact that he is that, there is that the gene of the noir detective in his creation, except for, of course, there's a reason why he does that, and that's because he has to rely on all these artifacts and gadgets, and so he needs places on his body to hide them that makes it easily accessible. So there's an actual logical reason for him to be partaking of this cliche. But yeah, I agree with you that I think it's a very astute observation. I haven't actually read the anthology that you're referencing, but I really like that the mix of noir and horror birthing urban fantasy. And it's interesting. I think that it started out that way, but many writers by their nature are contrarians. So now you have people like Simon Green and Mike Resnick and others, writing very funny versions of urban fantasy, with their characters being snarky and hilarious. And so it's a way to subvert tropes, which we all like to do when we write.
Yeah, I can absolutely see that. I mean, my understanding, there was always a bit of snark in noir, and but yeah, I can absolutely see the examples of people getting a little lighter with it, a little less grim in the way that noir can be. I mean, the two that really come to me, and I don't know if you've read either of them, are The Case of the Toxic Spell Dump by Harry Turtlelove, which is a sort of a fantasy detective book filled with puns, which I think are funny, and Curiosity by Paul Jenkins, which is very much a snarky take on noir fantasy tropes, which I also thought was quite amusing. So those are two other works in that contrarian-ish tradition, because I say writers like to be contrarian. I mean, that's how originality happens. And so I don't really know where I was going with that.
So I haven't read either of those two specific books, but I've been reading science fiction and fantasy since I was about 10 years old. And when I was young, because we didn't have 300 channels and like 10 streaming services available to us at the time, I was devouring an average of like 2 books a day. So I was actually speed reading. I was able to speed read in Russian, which I could not do in English, which is actually is kind of sad and unfortunate, because I wish I could. I'd be able to consume so many more books.
Yeah.
So I definitely I was definitely well grounded in the genre tradition before I ever committed anything to paper myself.
Yeah.
And it's not just those books, and there's a healthy amount of stuff of literature from Russian and Ukrainian writers that is mixed in as well, because plus also writers that have been translated into Russian from other languages but may not necessarily be available in English. So French writers, writers from other parts of the world, particularly French. Like there's a lot of really good French science fiction and Polish science fiction that we had access to growing up that hasn't really been translated into English much. So all those were influences.
I remember that the Middling Affliction is at least partly set in Eastern Europe. Would you say that Russian and Ukrainian literature, does that have any influence on the book that you can?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. So I, having grown up with those traditions, I definitely wanted to use them, and with a pretty good chunk of the book taking place in Ukraine, which was completely unintentional. I wrote it long before current events, and so it wasn't a commentary on anything. It just sort of so happened that unfortunately, we got invaded since then. But I definitely drew on my knowledge of the region and also on my knowledge of Slavic and Eastern European mythology, because there's at least one character that's presented in the book in a way that has not really been. I don't want to spoil which character it is for the readers, but that character has not. While the creature type is well known, the way that the character is written is very uniquely Slavic, and hasn't really been presented in any books that I can think of that are at least that I've read in English in that particular way. So hopefully that'll be fun for the readers.
Oh yeah, it was definitely enjoyable for me, particularly the use of one particular Ukrainian location, which I won't spoil. You have to read the book. Read the book. So I really like that. That whole other cultural influence in a way that I mean a lot of American writers that can feel like they read only American stuff, and it I don't know, it can become a little samey after a while. But I really liked what you did with that, and so since we're talking about Eastern Europe in translation, so let's just shift gears a bit. You've done a fair amount of translation of science fiction works from Eastern Europe, and you also compiled a translation from all over the world into the Rosetta Archive, the anthology that I reviewed for Warp Factor. So, what? Just starting off, what made you get into the translation business, and like what made you want to start?
Well, my first language is Russian. I grew up in Ukraine, but in the Russian speaking part of Ukraine. So that is that was the language that I was born with. And while I don't use it to write, so it's not as lively and as active for me as English, I understand it pretty much 100%. I mean, I'm very fluent in it. And so for a long time, I used it just to enjoy reading works in more than one language. And at some point, I was just like, well, wouldn't it be cool to geek out about these really, really awesome stories with my friends who can't read Russian? And on a whim, I secured the rights and translated a single short story, and which just so I could share it with Anglophone fans. And I found the process to be so fun and refreshing, and it feels so different from writing to me. It actually feels more like doing Sudoku or a jigsaw puzzle to me, because I don't have to think about the plot. I don't have to think about developing the characters or anything like that. What I have to think about is these are the words and sort of the voice and the tone that the author has originally written. How do I retain as much of that as possible in a different language? What do I do with wordplay? What do I do with pop culture allusions that are referring to things that a reader in the United States or in United Kingdom or anywhere else in English would not understand? What do I do with something that is very cultural and just sort of refers to history and that again, like a foreign reader will not necessarily be privy to. It'll feel like an inside joke. How do I make it easy and fun and comfortable for a reader in an entirely different language to basically have a similar reading experience to what somebody would get if they're a fluent speaker. And so I found that I was both good at this based on the fact that I've had more success placing my translations in terms of their short fiction sales than even my own short stories. I mean, it's been pretty much in every major, every major magazine and short fiction market in the English language for science fiction and fantasy. But also it's a tremendous amount of fun, and it actually doesn't take that long for me. Like I'm a pretty quick translator. So over time, I went from doing it as a hobby to doing a lot more translation for publication, but also taking it on as jobs. So I've translated for movie studios, for publishers, for video game companies, and a lot of it is bucket list type stuff because it was just really, really fun to be able to participate on projects at those levels.
So I can imagine that. I mean, the way you put it, from my perspective, is there's a lot of trying to translate the human element, because just getting the emotion from one language to another and preserving that even when the languages are so different, because I mean they're written in two different alphabets, so, and two very different well, more than two than very different cultures. So I can imagine that's I mean, it sounds difficult to me, but if you can speak both fluently, I can see how it would engage the jigsaw part of the part of your mind.
It is difficult, but this is where your experience and the time served as a writer comes into play, because you are already experienced writers make for the best translators. That's why when you have works translated from Chinese by Ken Liu are on a completely different level from even other good translators, because he's such an amazing writer in his own right.
Yeah.
And so being a writer really helps with that. That's what makes it feel a little bit easier, because you already concerned yourself with, sort of the poetry of the language and how to make it sound appealing to the reader. But also, it's not just the human element, it's also the tone of the story that you want to try to retain. Think about it this way. If you read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the voice and the way that the way that the author plays with the language and kind of the tone that he sets is what provides the humor to that story. Because if you strip that voice out, then it's a pretty from the first chapter, it's a pretty horrific story that is apocalyptic, right?
Yes.
But instead, he makes it bitingly funny.
Yes.
And as a translator, your job is to, when you read the work that you're trying to translate, your job is to kind of understand what voice the author is going for, what tone, what what timbre the author is trying to present, and then do your damnness to replicate that in the story. So it's not just every one of those translated stories are in my voice as an author. That's we don't want that. We want each story to be as close as possible to the original in that regard.
Yeah, I can absolutely see that. That's why I've heard it said that comedy is very hard to translate, because oftentimes it's very contextual to the culture it's from, and it can be hard to render that into another language, and with all the baggage that another language has, because it's from a totally different culture, and so that's just not an easy thing. I mean, I've read TV tropes pages about translating whatever it is, and the stuff people come up with to get a joke across in a different language looks like a titanic amount of effort, really, and it's impressive. And of course, I've heard that that sometimes translations make it better. Like you said at Discon that Twilight is a much better read in Russian.
No, I said that the Da Vinci Code is
Oh,
a
sorry, Da Vinci
is the
Code.
yeah,
Sorry.
I don't think I would undertake reading Twilight in any language. No offense, no offense to the author or to anyone who enjoys it. It's just not for me.
Sorry, Da Vinci Code.
I have heard it. I read the Da Vinci Code in English personally, but I've heard from many people who speak both languages that they found it a much more pleasing experience in Russian because the translator was a better line by line level writer than the author, whereas the author's tight plotting and fast paced story remain. That's his strengths. The weaknesses, which is not necessarily the best line by line language, disappear when they're translated into another language by another competent
Yeah,
author slash translator.
yeah. When we go back to the original point, the best translators are the good writers to begin with,
Right.
and then so they have the skills in both domains because really they're two different domains that end up making the Russian Da Vinci Code much more readable than English the Da Vinci Code. So, to talk about more specific works of translation, I've read a few of your translations. I read Tales of Ack and Humanity, your English language version of that, and I read one by this Russian author. I don't. It was in I think FNSF a couple months back. So
Are you thinking about Lajos and his bees?
yes, that one. Yes, I read that translation of yours, and I very much enjoyed both. So,
Thank
how do you choose which stories to translate? Because I'd imagine there's a fair amount out there that isn't in English. So, how do you choose which ones to? Let's just write this up and send it to the English people.
So this is where my experience as an anthologist and editor comes into play, right? I've had, before I started actively seeking stories for translations, I've had a number of years experience editing anthologies and
Mm.
reading submissions and, basically selecting 10 to 15 stories out of 1,000 submissions to publish. So essentially what I'm looking for in a translation to start with is the same as I'm looking for in a story I want to publish. It needs to be a story that I'm really excited to share with readers, right? So when I read a submission and I get that one gem out of like 100 plus, submissions that had to be discarded, where I go, oh my God, I'm so excited. I can't wait for the moment when other people can read the story too. That's the one that I want to go for. But it actually goes a little bit further than that with translations. And in that sense, I'm looking for stories that are uniquely parts of the culture that I'm translating from on some level, because if it's just another story that's like a techno thriller or something that an American author could have written, then what am I really adding to the to the Anglosphere culture by importing this story as well, right? Like, I mean, somebody else could have written that from from Chicago or Schenectady, then why bother, right? So I try to choose the stories that are in some way uniquely Russian or uniquely Ukrainian, and they have something to say that a typical Anglophone person may not have said in the same way.
Yeah, that's very interesting. The whole adding something new to the broader Anglophone culture, which but just by dint of circumstances, kind of becoming the world culture because it's the lingua franca. And so, I mean, I think a lot of us often forget that there's a lot of culture produced in other languages, and a lot of that can be that uniquely reflects the particular reality of a place that isn't an English speaking country. And I think it's good to have access to that as English speakers, even if we're not fluent in the other language, because there's been a lot of talk about Korean movies recently with Parasite winning an Oscar, and and in the science fiction sphere, a lot of the Chinese stuff being translated by Ken Liu and Joel Martinson. I think those are the big two. And I mean, what I think is interesting with a lot of the Chinese stuff is that you can see the influence of the Anglophone stuff, but they're very much putting their own spin on it. Like Cixin Liu's Ball Lightning, I thought was a very Chinese techno thriller told from their perspective, and the Americans are the opponents. And I thought that was very interesting to see a country doing of taking something that is on the surface familiar to us, but totally flipping the script, and it's a very different story as a result. So that's a very interesting way of thinking about it. So you put together the Rosetta Archive, which wasn't just Eastern European and stuff; it's stuff from all over the world. Would you say that was a different experience because it's not in your cultural wheelhouse? You also have to judge stuff from Latin America, from Asia, from Africa. Was that a different experience in your mind?
So I already do that for the last 3 to 4 years. I've been editing Future Science Fiction Digest, which is a magazine, a quarterly magazine that
Okay.
with a very strong focus on international fiction. In
Okay.
fact, we only accept submissions that are either translations or that are written by authors who reside in primarily non-Anglophone countries.
Okay.
Even the story is written in English directly.
Okay.
So I already had years of experience sort of selecting these stories, and there's definitely a certain adjustment because the way that the modes of storytelling are so different in across cultures, right? And so if you judge it by sort of like the American, hey, hook me by the first two paragraphs, and tell me the story that kind of fits into this sort of rigid structure, a lot of the better stuff from around the world may not fit into into that particular framework. So you have to kind of judge it differently. And I found that out very quickly when I started submitting translations for publication. And the responses I was getting were like, well, this is kind of good, but it just doesn't like it doesn't hook the reader quickly enough. And I'm like, well, that is not how fiction is generally written in Russian. You're not there to hook the reader with the first couple of lines. You're more likely to immerse the reader in the world of your story, kind of slowly. It's slowly walking into the ocean as opposed to like taking a running start and jumping into a pool.
Yeah.
And every language and every culture kind of has its own unique way. And of course, there are going to be examples to disprove the trope, but it overall has its own sort of style and way of telling the story, and you have to adjust to that a little bit. And I feel like for people who are not already reading a lot of international fiction, I tried to structure the Rosetta anthology in a way that would present how different the stories can be told while simultaneously being told about such concepts that are true to every culture, including our own. They're all stories of love and loss of relationships and and struggle, and all these concepts are completely universal, but they're being talked about in very, very different ways. And I think that it's a journey that's, for anybody who likes reading short fiction, it's a journey worth taking.
Yeah, absolutely. I've made a point to read more international stuff, although that isn't although not all the time, but I've absolutely read the translated Chinese stuff and your anthology and stuff from other parts of the world, and I found it to be a very interesting experience because I mean, as you say, there's a certain universality here, but there's also a very particular localness that because on the one hand we're all made of the same human stuff, a very basic level, but on the other hand, the local geography, the local culture, the local politics, all that is very much affecting the uh, the story and the way that the authors think and just how the story goes from idea to published short story. Because having gotten a few of my stories published, I know the process. And on the specific nature of a Russian the Russian short story structure you talk about. I mean, I think the speculative genres are in many ways suited to that slow, immersive storytelling because so much of it's world building, so much of it is building that setting, and some people understandably get attached to that setting. They want to walk you through it, and so I think I mean I write alternate history, so there's a lot of that in the genre, for good or for ill, and people argue about that for very, very, very long conversation. So that's interesting to hear in that regard. I think I touched on all the things I wanted to say. So do you have any closing remarks?
Yeah, so I definitely this whole month is going to be for primarily promoting the book for me. The book is coming out on May 31st, and we're going to do a book launch at Balticon at the end of the month. I will also be doing a number of events, both online and in person, throughout the summer. So please pick it up. They're very inexpensive to pre-order, especially an ebook, and every pre-order helps ensure that the publisher will pick up the sequel, which has already been written.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Schwartzman. It was nice to have you on board, and that's all. Thank you very much, and thank you, Warp Factor, for watching.
Thank
That's
you.
all. Good night.